welcome to another episode of the Alley Report, a subsidiary of the Service Department. And we are talking today with Brandon Applegate, author of Those We Leave Behind and Those We Left Behind and Other Stories, and Patrick Barb, author of the children's horror story collection Pre-Proof for Haunting, and both you know part of the Hungry Shadow Press, which is just putting out the best right now.
Thanks, man. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, great to be here. Very
Um,
excited.
and with Hungry Shadow, you both have a couple things coming out soon.
Yeah. So Hungry Shadow is releasing, we're releasing the second volume in our It Was All a Dream series here in just a few days, August 13th. Uh, Thanks for that. And then we're also going to release Patrick's book that he's editing. And Patrick, I stumble over this title because it is a long title, but it is and one day we will die.
Yep.
Uh, strange stories inspired by the music of Neutral Milk Hotel, which
Nailed
is
it in one.
yeah,
I love
nailed it
that.
in one.
The title is short. It's the subtitle that gets
It's
you.
it's
Yeah.
always the subtitle that gets you because that's the same thing with It Was All a Dream series. Short title, but then another anthology of bad horror tropes done right,
Yeah,
is
you got to get all that SEO. You got to get
Oh
all your
yeah.
search terms in there for the
Well, long titles are the thing right now. Like,
right, right,
every,
right. Yeah,
people love them.
yeah. And then third thing we're releasing under Hungry Shadow here upcoming is the first time I've ever attempted to release a comic book, Vault of Shadows. Will
I
be
love that.
coming at some point. So yeah.
Which I love. So in the same short time period, EC Comics is back,
I
and we're
know.
getting your version of that. So it's amazing.
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun reading the stories for that so far, and like just trying to think through everything that I'm reading in a more visual way to kind of close the gap there. It's should be a lot of fun.
And I love that the stuff y'all putting out just so so unique, so different from what everybody else is doing. How did a neutral milk? How did that get started? Because I love that.
Yeah. Well, I my philosophy with like the books that I write and the things that I try to publish, and that sometimes people let me publish with them, is one of those like if it's something that I would want to read or I want to see in the world and it doesn't exist, then it's kind of like it's on me to make it happen a lot of times. And sometimes that means you write a vampire pro wrestling novella or you write a story about the ghost of a giant ape in New York City or something like that. And I've done those books. And I had the idea that I wanted to do an anthology of kind of weird fiction, some horror, some kind of like strange stories about the band Neutral Milk Hotel, the band from the 90s, late 90s that I discovered in high school, and really just stuck with me. It's a band that put out two actual albums. Then they went on a very long hiatus, came back and did a couple of tours, or did a tour, and then haven't played since like 2015, I want to say. Um, so but the music and the lead singer and writer is a gentleman named Jeff Mangum. It's strange, it's psychedelic, it's a folk music, it's noise rock, it's a little bit of everything. And he draws from all these different inspirations. A lot of it is like related to World War II, particularly Anne Frank, but also like his own sort of like dream logic and everything. And so I just felt like this is a band that is made for weird fiction.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like the scary type of weird fiction. And it's I like because like some music you listen to, it's like, oh, this is like meant to be quote unquote scary music, or this is meant to be frightening or something like that.
Mhm.
And this didn't feel like that. But I also kind of felt like it was a good launching point for writers
Yeah.
to take these songs and kind of come up with their own stories, come up with their own kind of way of twisting things. And really the one direction that we gave to the authors, both the ones we invited and the ones submitting through the open call was, you know, you can't really mention like the song or use like lyrics very blatantly or in the stories. But other than that, it's like you have freedom to go where you want to with this. And people really did. And I was just blown away by the quality of the stories we got in, the quality of the submissions, um, putting it together, picking the stories. It was a hard time. Let me tell you, it was like there was a lot of like when it came down to the wire, there were some that were just like go either way here, but you just want to have
Yeah.
that like a mixtape effect really with a collection like this that's inspired by music and hopefully that's what we have.
Well, and I feel like a lot of times when you horror authors talk about what inspires horror stuff, it's not scary things or other horror properties. It's something else. Like, so to me, it makes sense. Like, choose a musician or something else as a launching pad.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think I could ever have an anthology because, like, you talked about a lot, like the difficulty of rejecting stories of like, oh, this one's so close, but it comes down to the wire.
Yeah. There have been numerous projects where I bought more stories than I intended to buy because it was just impossible to choose, and it's happened numerous times. I mean, I can think of a couple right off the top of my head that I'm still kicking myself over. But yeah, it's a hard time for sure, especially on something like what Patrick's put together. It's an incredible book.
Yeah, and
Um,
then Brandon's done this a few times, and this is my first. I Before I got into writing, I spent a long time working in book publishing, being on the other side of the table, mostly doing like acquisitions and some development work. So I kind of wanted to get away from that role when I was doing a lot of the writing stuff, my early short stories, and then some of the novellas and the collections that I put out. But then this idea wouldn't leave me alone, so I wanted to do this. I'm like, I'll get back in the editing chair one more time just to do this anthology. More stuff happens, we'll see. But it was interesting because yes, you there are some stories that were I won't say easy to reject. There were stories that just didn't fit the vibe, and I think I went into the project very clearly knowing what the like sort of wide spectrum vibe of the stories I wanted it to be.
Mhm.
Um, and so there were some that could just kind of get out that way. When it came down to the wire, those final stories, those ones that just like almost made it, I could take comfort in the fact that I was like, this story is good enough that I'm going to read it somewhere else. And I'd like to include
yeah.
that in like the letters to folks to say like, look, I look forward to reading this somewhere else because it's that level of quality. It's just not the right it's not the right note right now for what we're putting together here, basically.
I think
And
it's such an important point to make when we're talking about what it means to edit an anthology is having that clear picture going in, or you either have to have that clear picture going in of exactly what you want it to be and the vibe that you're shooting for, or you have to be really open to being led by a few things, depending on kind of where the project comes from, and I think Patrick's ability to shoot for the shoot for exactly what he had in mind is really going to come through here.
Oh, it's gonna be amazing. I can't wait to read it. Yeah, we talked about like I'll see this story elsewhere. I think that's I when I've had stories rejected from anthologies, and then like I want to use it in my other stuff, and I realize it can't stand on its own outside of like the prompt, and I'm like, oh, that's why. Like that's why I didn't make it. Like it can't stand on its own. Okay, yeah, that's so. I think that's one thing with writers. Like when you write for a specific thing, your story needs to have legs on its own outside of the context of the anthology.
Yeah, I mean that's something I always try to like when I'm doing my own writing is I want to get the idea that feels the most like a Patrick story, first and foremost, and then look at the prompt. And so you got to kind of marry those two elements together, like making it uniquely your just a way of telling the story, but also kind of addressing the prompt. And I mean, I had a story that was written for. I don't know if you guys remember that, like the Nicolas Cage, kind of
Oh
like
yeah,
bizarre
I read
weird
that.
fiction call,
I remember.
and I wrote it for that call. It did not make that call, but then it was published in this like folk horror because I had taken this like Nicolas Cage, all of like the references to like Face Off and the bees and the Wicker Man, and I made this kind of like folk horror story out of it, and that ended up going in this folk horror anthology. So like I think it is possible to like get very very specific and then still find some new life somewhere. I mean, one instance at least that I can think of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll call out too your story in the first It Was All a Dream anthology, man. Like I think that one and it was Don't Go in the Woods or Do See If I Care, what I believe was the
Yeah.
title of that story. And um you are definitely doing what the prompt says to do, which is take a trope that is present in horror fiction or horror movies and either turn it on its head or make it the best version of itself, right? You're absolutely
Mm-hmm.
doing what it says to do in the prompt. But if I just read that as a standalone in one of your collections, I would not, uh, I wouldn't be at all confused
Yeah.
about why it was there. So I think you do a fantastic job of that, man.
Thank you.
Um,
Yeah.
and speaking of, it was all Dream Volume 1 and 2. Were there ever instances where in reading submissions you came across people talking about tropes that's like you didn't even realize was a trope, or you're like, oh, I hadn't considered this.
I mean, so in the It Was All a Dream books, I am very uh sort of standoffish about the trope portion of it. Like I want to be able to, when I'm reading the story, I'm reading for good quality stories, and I'm honestly going to ask the author at the end of it. Like if I can't tell what the trope is, I'm going to ask the author, "Hey, what were you writing for here as far as the trope was concerned?" Because what I want is, stories I want to read, stories that hit me on an emotional level first, and then the trope thing actually comes second, believe it or not. And but what I find happens more often than what you're talking about is the thought that, oh, hey, this aims for the cat jump scare trope, or this aims for this. Like I think that when I'm reading it, and then I take it back to the author and I'm like, and I'll talk to them about it. And they were shooting either for an entirely different trope and that other stuff just happened to be in there, or they were shooting for two and I missed, or two or three or four and I missed a couple. And so I think everybody tropes are something that people experience differently. It's sort of a personal thing almost. And so what hits me as a trope may not always hit the next person as a trope. So yeah.
That's what's so interesting, I think, about the fact you include the story notes in those
Yeah.
is that you get to see, because I've had the same experience reading them as a reader. Is just like seeing like, oh, I think it's about this trope, and then it's like something completely different that you don't consider. And it's just always fun to kind of get the behind the scenes.
Yeah.
There are not story notes for "And One Day We Will Die," but if it sells well, maybe we'll do like special edition down the road or
Ooh,
something.
yeah, I like that.
So we'll get people incentives to come back for more. Come back to the well.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm a big fan of story notes, but I did definitely understand why you wouldn't want to do it with something like And One Day We Will Die. It because that feels like this book to me feels very much like a exploration of the themes inherent in the individual songs, and we do call out the songs in the on the first page of every story just so people know what song they're actually referencing. But I think people's connection with music, and especially this kind of music,
Mm.
is so personal that I would almost rather them have the experience of figuring out how it aligns, because it's going to be different for everybody that reads that story, than for us to just straight out tell them.
Yeah, I mean, I would love, this is the experience that I had, reading the stories the first go through and then reading it when I was making the final decisions. And that's putting on the song that is referenced or that is inspiring the story, listening to that before reading the story, or kind of letting it bleed into my reading of the story.
Mhm.
Um, because that way I could like listen to the song, but also kind of experience it through this interpretation. And I mean, this anthology, it's got everything from like sci-fi kind of horror, sci-fi weird fiction. It's got sort of alternate history stuff. It's got um like just kind of like weird sort of phantasmagorical type of stories that are like slices of life, but um the character is a mirror. come to life or something like that. And it's just some just very interesting choices that if you listen to the songs, you as the individual may not have, that may not be the first thing that comes to mind. But then when you think about the song and you read the stories in tandem, it's like, oh, well, this makes perfect sense. And I'm glad that somebody came along and made this connection. And that's kind of what's so, I think, so special about these kind of anthologies where something's inspired by X or Y, is because you get to experience how somebody else interprets a piece of media and what that it evokes in them.
Yeah, almost like a conversation between the author and the reader, which I know feels a little cheesy to say, but it's like this is how it's a window into how the author interprets something that the reader then, I mean, I'm kind of repeating what you said, but then gets to experience and then make those sort of calls about like, well, why did somebody else see it this way? But yeah, 100%, man.
I'd kind of like to see even more focus than other anthologies on music because it can be interpreted in such wildly different ways for the listener. Um, like I feel like a Mountain Goats horror
Oh
Mountain
yeah,
anthology.
goat. Yeah.
absolutely. That's actually, I mean, between is Mountain Goats and Decemberists were another one. I thought, although their songs
Yeah.
are so story heavy already, I feel like I'm like almost worried that it'd be harder to pull inspiration from. But I would be interested to see how people might handle it. The thing I liked about the Neutral Milk Hotel stuff is like it's so almost like a kaleidoscope, right? You twist it and you're going to see different shapes. You're going to get different interpretations. Even just listening to the lyrics, there's this cacophony of sound and vocals and everything like that that comes into play. And it left a lot of just left a lot of room. I look at like a lot of these. There's a period in like mid 2000s, I guess, when there was a lot of crime anthologies that were inspired by like Bruce Springsteen or Johnny Cash or things like that. And like people were drawing from these kind of like rough and tumble, all American kind of, songwriters and things. And you didn't see as much of it in horror and weird fiction. And so there was a gap to be filled. And so we slid right in there.
Yeah, I like doing things with horror and weird fiction that have been done in other genres or in other spaces. Uh Almost feels like claiming a spot for my favorite thing there too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Go ahead and plant our horror flag.
Yeah.
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 Well, can't let crime have all the fun.
I
Mystery,
Yeah.
know, right?
fantasy, forget about it.
And when you think about it, it's rife for it. I mean, William Sterling has his anthology project that he's working on. I forget which press he's working with, but that is
Trueborn,
a
I think. Punk rock one.
Yeah.
Trueborn. Yeah, the goth punk anthology that he's working through that he and I chatted about briefly before, and his original idea was My Chemical Romance, and then he went with more of a wider lens on it. But like um I think that we're going to see a few of these popping up here and there because I've been approached with a few ideas even after
Oh,
that. So
nice.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
think we're going to see a bunch of them popping up, which is cool. And I think this was a great way to start the run.
I feel like you guys started the trend. Um, and then there was a Nirvana one that was gonna kind of do that, and then I don't know what happened with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of fizzled there, but I think the idea is still there. I mean, I think people, I think what happens is that is writers, I think the best writing comes from passion, right? Like something you're passionate about, whether it is like you're writing nonfiction, you're a journalist or something, you're passionate about the story that you're telling to people, or you're writing fiction, and there's a story that you have inside, and you care about something at the heart of it, whether it's the story, the themes, the character, whatever. And another thing that people feel incredibly passionate about, even if they're not talented in it, is music. Like we all, like I feel like a lot of writers I know, um, not talking about do you listen to music when you write, because I think that's a question that people get all the time and the answers differ. But I mean, if you ask writers, do you listen to music? Probably somebody out there is an outlier, I'm sure, but most people do because music is something that I like. For me, it's this expression of creativity that I'm not capable of in my case. I know there's other writers that are musically inclined, but like for me, it's like this is something I can't do, so I greatly enjoy it and get some uh, creative satisfaction and personal satisfaction from listening to it. And so I think that that is really kind of comes through in the popularity of like these music based projects. A lot of writers like we dig music.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
I think
I could not
yeah,
live without it. Like it is crucial to just every aspect of my life.
yeah. I mean, I grew up I grew up both watching, like, my introduction to horror was almost simultaneous books and movies because my mom was a huge horror buff, especially back in the 80s and 90s. And so she sort of introduced me to both of those things. And so when I started writing, I found that because so much of the roots of what I write come from movies, that
Mm-hmm.
I would soundtrack stories that I was writing in my head. This is the song that hits this mood. This is this is the sound or the type of soundtrack that I'm hearing in this scene that I'm writing. And uh, even outside of that, I I've been in bands. I am a musician myself, but I also just listen to music to give myself some sort of I mean, all art is just something that people create that is intended to evoke an emotional response in the other person. And I think in that way, music and writing are intertwined really inseparably. Um, they're intended to do the same thing with through different means. And so I guess what I'm getting at here is that they're sort of one and the same to me in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I absolutely have a soundtrack. Like for every, book I've written or story, there's a soundtrack or there's a specific song that is like
Yep.
I need to capture what this song is making me feel. Like that's the
Mhm.
goal.
Yep.
Like I love listening when authors include like the mixtapes and stuff, or like have like their Spotify list. Like I just eat it up. It's like, yeah, let me just listen to this because if I especially if I'm enjoying the story or the book that it's inspired, then I think it enhances that experience. But also get to learn about new music, right? And I think listening to what other writers are listening to is how I've gotten like to know a lot of bands and musicians and people that I dig. Um, and it's the same thing with like an anthology, right? Like you figure like, okay, I like Neutral Milk Hotel. I want to check out this book about stories. This is the fantasy here. And you open it up and you find some new writers. You find some people you don't know. I mean, even just editing this anthology, there are some, I think there are some genre heavy hitters. People like John Langan, Christy Nogle, there's some, and Brandon, I'm blanking on some of the other folks we have in here. Brian Evanson,
Brian
um,
Brian Evanson totally took me by surprise, but yeah,
came through the slush pile, and
I
just
could not believe he submitted to an open call. But anyway, please go ahead.
That's incredible.
and he just knocked it out of the park,
Absolutely.
with a story inspired by Garden Head, "Leave Me Alone" from the band, and but then there are new folks, the folks that I had not heard of that I think have really just stand shoulder to shoulder with the people that we like sought out and invited to the anthology. So for me, it's like that feeling of like when you discover a new band or you discover somebody like because they came up on your like recommended playlist or something. Um, I want to have that kind of feeling for the readers of this book, is that same kind of feeling of like discovering something new, and then hopefully seeking out more.
That's an interesting point because so often, like, you made me think about that in the way you were talking about it. So often when you're listening to music, the and you're going through whatever your suggested songs are on Spotify or whatever it is, and you're like, nope, not that one, nope, not that one, that's not the vibe, that's not the vibe, and you're going through, and then you find that one song, and that song just sort of carries you away. You don't even realize you've listened to the whole thing by the end of the song because it just carries you through to the end of it. And so many of the stories in this book were exactly the same way for me. Like as I was going through and reading it, especially once I had it all assembled in the formatting stage and stuff like that, and we had all the edits in and stuff. Uh, I would start one just to like see the flow of the story itself, like in the format, like I would look at it in the formatting and just read the first couple of pages, and then by the time I really even realized what I was doing, I was three-quarters of the way through the whole story.
I
uh
love it.
yeah, these stories pick you up and carry you through to the end of them. The flow is almost magical.
Yeah, I
And
mean, yeah, good material to work with. That makes it the editorial job and like the sequencing that much easier. I mean, I applied a lot of the same things that I use for my collections and then sort of sequencing those. And this is all stuff that I've stolen from Gordon B. White and things that he says about putting together collections and thinking about short songs, long songs, breaks, thematic kind of bridges between, one type of story and the next type of story. That all kind of goes into it. And it's the same thing is the cliche of putting together an album is almost the same as putting together a collection. And you want to kind of have your just a banger out of the gate, and then you want to have like something that closes it that people are going to remember. And luckily here we also had a lot of good stories that were in between too, so it's all killer no filler here.
Love it.
And I love like the when you have an anthology like this and you attract like first time writers, new writers. It's almost like you've kickstarted a new
Yeah.
writer. Like they saw the call, they're like, oh, I love this band, I love this music. I can do this. Like you had an
Yeah, I mean,
influence on the writing world.
that was one of my first professional sale was to a Beatles alternate history anthology. And I did this story that is since I've reprinted it since then. But it's basically about Paul McCartney and the whole like Paul is dead thing. But like he really does keep dying and keep getting resurrected. He can't die, but he keeps dying
That's great.
life. And that was like I was among, some fairly well-known sci-fi and horror and fantasy authors in that call. And it's one of those things where you kind of feel like, okay, I can do this. I can actually like write stories. I can sell them. And also it was one of those stories where I saw the call, I had the idea, and it was one of the first times I can remember where the idea and the execution kind of came together in a way where I felt like, oh, this is what I wanted to write. And so, I mean, it happens more often now, a little bit more experience and everything. But yeah, there was a time when, um, that didn't always happen. And this was one of the first times it was like, okay, this is nice. I can do this. And so, I didn't think about it now, but I just made the connection here on this in this conversation that yes, I had a music band based anthology that kickstarted my kind of push in writing. And so now hopefully paying it back a little bit.
I hate to have I hate to have a anthology that I work on or put together pass without somebody who is first time, somebody who I've never heard of. Um, if it's all heavy hitters and no discovery, then you kind of already know what you're going to get because, we're uh here in this horror community, there's thousands of us, but we all are often feeding back into ourselves. We're if I publish a John Langan story, I'm publishing it to people who have read a lot of John Langan, and so it feels almost wrong to let an opportunity to discover something new pass.
Yeah, because I mentioned this in another interview, but like I at half price I picked up some anthologies that were like made in the '80s, and they were like the heavy hitters of the day. And it's the same thing. It was everybody who's everybody, and they're kind of dull. But then like you get like an indie anthology with like you said new voices, diversity to it. Like they're awesome. They're great. Like you're dragged in. It becomes your favorite thing you're reading. You find new authors.
Yeah. And the comment I get most often when people read anthologies, mine or literally anybody's, is that, well, it's an anthology, so that means not all the stories are going to work for me, right? But it's funny how that's almost by design because I think the job of editing is intensely personal to the editor. So the editor is going to pull together all things that work for him, but everything that works for me is never going to work for every single person. And so when I put something out there that I'm like, you should discover this. This is this new thing. It's because I discovered it, right? Like it's It's and when I say I discovered it, it's like I discovered it for me. It's not like I'm, like taking ownership of it in any way. It's like this is extremely cool. Like I almost feel like I'm getting to show my friends, like look at this thing. But
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes you think about goes with short story collections and anthologies. The question comes up sometimes where people are like, what's your favorite story in the collection, or what's your favorite story in the anthology?" And I'm always like, well, that's an unfair question. Second, I mean, I when I'm putting together either the TOC for a collection that I'm doing or an anthology, it's not about the individual story a lot of times. The individual story it can stand on its own, hopefully, but it's also about like the sequencing and the way you move from one story to the next. And so, like, I'd rather somebody ask, like, "Oh, what's your favorite transition from one story to the next in this anthology?" Or like, "What's like the best sequence of stories?" Because I think that's really more, to my mind, like the editorial side of things, is like finding these things you like and then saying, "Okay, what order do these puzzle pieces go in? Like, how do I put this together so that it is one thing, this
Yeah.
anthology?" I like to read from start to finish, and not everybody does. I put things together for that complete experience, for that from the beginning to the end. But then it's like an album, right? If you want to choose to listen to the third track 5 times, go with God, dude. Do what you got to do. That's fine by me.
Yep.
Yeah, I when I read anthologies, I usually read just beginning to end because I it's like with an album, if I'm gonna listen to it for the first time, I wanna listen to beginning to end. Then I might go back and re-listen to my favorite tracks over and over again or obsess over certain parts of it. But the initial experience is usually track 1 to the end, for me at
Yeah.
least.
I mean, no, I'm exactly the same way. Like it's because I know that the author or the editor did this on purpose. That's the main reason. Because I'm reading a book, either a short story collection or an anthology, to I'm doing it to experience the art of an artist, right? Like there's an artist here.
Yeah.
There's either an editor or there's a writer who has created this work of art. And for me, like going through the first time and reading it out of order is uh it's taking away an element of what that artist was trying to do. And so I mean I always read through from beginning to end, and there are times when I'll read through and get halfway through and there's a story that's not working for me and I will get legitimately stuck
Yeah.
because I'm like, I don't want to skip this, but it's killing me. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done that where the one trips you up, it's like, "Man, this is amazing. This one's not working." And it's the longest one in this anthology. Why is it right in the middle? Like,
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, yep, it happens.
well, thank you both so much for coming on here. This has been awesome. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. This is
It was
great.
it was good to Elford. I think we've talked online for like 5 years or something
yeah,
like that, something
seriously,
crazy
yeah.
like that, and I've literally never heard your voice, so it was good to hear your voice, man.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, so there we go. Like that's you have a
Thank
voice
you
to
for
put
the
to put to the
chat.
beautiful
Appreciate it.
face on my profile picture.
There we go.
For sure. Thanks for having us, man.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And everybody, you know, be sure to pick up this anthology. Pick uh
And one day we will die.
I didn't want to get it wrong.
Strange. Yep. Strange stories inspired by the music of Neutral Milk Hotel. One
Yeah.
shot did it twice, Patrick. I'm very impressed with myself right
Awesome.
There we go.
Hey.
Yes.
now.
Celebration.
Not in November, so
Yep.
time for your Christmas shopping.
Damn
Love it.
right.